The FIDE Candidates 2022 tournament round 3 has come to a conclusion. Today's recap, we're going to talk about the odds going into this round. We're going to go through the 4 games together, and then we will look at the updated odds going into round number 4. So these were the odds going into today's round. We see Caruana here sitting at 41%. The rest of the field is around 15% or lower, with Jan Nepomniachtchi leading that pack because he has 1.5 out of 2, same as Caruana. So let's jump into the first game of the day. We have Timur Radjabov with the white pieces, Jan Nepomniachtchi with the black pieces. One thing to think about for today's games is the psychology of a draw offer. This is something that it's hard to understand, I think, for most of us normal players, but the super GMs really value the advantage of having the white pieces. So oftentimes, if one player is a little bit stronger or they're having a better result, they might be more likely to offer a draw to another player who's a little bit lower rated or struggling a bit in the event if the stronger or advantageous position player has the black pieces. So in this game, we see Jan Nepomniachtchi, who has a +1 record, against Radjabov, who has a -1 record so far. And Nepomniachtchi is also quite a bit higher rated. So the rating here says 2753. Timur's actually now down to about 2735, and Jan has like a 30 or 35 point rating edge. So keep that in mind going into this game. So we see this Queen's Gambit decline structure by Nepomniachtchi, and then we see G3 by Timur. And this is heading towards the Catalan. We have a Chess Goals course on the Catalan, 25% off right now in the description. So there's an open Catalan with D takes C4. And I like these lines a lot for white. What tends to happen is the pawns all trade off, and in the end, white does get this G2 bishop, applying long-term pressure across the diagonal. And for this video, I'm showing the engine lines above. Let me know what you think of that in the comments, as well as the eval bar. Just because these players are so good, I think it's helpful. All right, so the queens come off the board. White's going to scoop this pawn back up. The best way for black to give it back is to play C3 and ruin white's pawn structure. So now we see white has 2 isolated pawns on the queen side. This is all very standard. Look at the clocks. Hour 55 versus hour and 43. They start with 2 hours, no increment. So now we see a few more trades. And at this point, if you watch enough Super Grandmaster chess, you can kind of already get the sense for what's about to happen. All of these trades are occurring. There's no real big imbalances in the position anymore. The pawns are exactly symmetric, rooks, 2 rooks each, knight and bishop each. This is the classic Super GM, let's agree to a draw. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. They trade these pawns, knowing that the C pawn's about to drop, and then they go into this dead drawn position, but it's only 20 moves in. I'm not sure what the rules are for this tournament for agreeing to a draw. I think they have to get to move number 30. So look what happens. They start shuffling. Neither side's really making any progress. Move 30 hits, draw agreed. So these guys were pretty content early on going for this draw. They really just swapped everything off, agreed to the draw. So that was the first game of the day. Not super exciting. Neither side had any big advantage. Just that real slight Catalan advantage out of the opening for Radjabov, but nothing to write home about. Next, we have Ding Liren against Richard Rapport, and there were some fireworks in this one. So we see a kind of King's Indian or Grunfeld setup by Rapport. If he goes bishop to G7 here, that's King's Indian defense. He opts for D5, which is the Grunfeld. Grunfeld has a little bit more respect at the Super GM level than the King's Indian. So I wouldn't really expect to see many King's Indians unless it's just a big surprise weapon for black. So takes, E4, takes on C3. This is all theory. And the idea in the Grunfeld, white gets this big center. We see these 3 pawns, but black plays dynamically. They put this bishop on G7 pointing at the center. They put the pawn on C5 striking at the center, and the pawn on D4 could become a target. So that's the idea. White builds the big center. Black just starts attacking that center, going for compensation for those pawns. So both sides are very focused on this pawn on D4. This is all pretty standard. Bishop B7. So we can see all minor pieces are developed for both sides. Now there's this move bishop to b5. What white could be threatening here is to potentially take on c6, relieving some of the pressure in the center, and then maybe pushing and locking things up. Queen d2, possibly eyeing bishop to h6, but also simply connecting the rooks. White usually wants to put the f rook onto d1, so both sides are just trying to improve their position. C takes d, this is usually what happens in the Grunfeld. So now we reach this structure. The weakest pawn on the board is d4, but it's also a good pawn for white because it helps control all of these squares on the fifth rank. That pawn duo e4 and d4, very strong for white. Queen to d6, rook d1, queen b4. So now we see a queen trade offer. The reason that Rapport is going for a queen trade is with the queens off the board, there is more focus on the weakest pawn. So this is something to keep in mind in your own games. When you have an advantage in space and an advantage in a pawn structure with like this e4 and d4, if your opponent's able to trade off queens, they could potentially take it into an advantageous endgame for them where those pawns become weaknesses. So that's what's happening here. And we see Ding avoids the queen trade with queen to d3 and then plays h4. I like this move a lot. This is something that computers have taught us in the last 5 years. These h-pawn pushes, especially against a Fianchetto structure, can really cause some problems for the opponent. And the eval here is only 0.3. The best move for black is to play pawn to h5, blocking this h4 pawn. And now we see that eval bar creep up 1.2 after rook f to d8. This is a small mistake. And Ding plays bishop to g5. Chess.com marks it as a great move, hitting the rook. And it looks like at first glance, maybe black could get away with some sort of knight takes d4 tactics. It's actually the best move for black, because if black is forced to play f6, for example, now these pawns are very weak. Like this pawn on e6 lined up with the king. Black doesn't want to do that. And it also kind of encourages white to play h5, hitting this pawn complex. Every time you push a pawn in front of your king, it creates weaknesses, and white's king is sitting here perfectly safe. So black does not want to play f6, and Rapport calculates out that knight takes d4 is, in fact, the best move. And after bishop takes d8, rook takes, now we see this imbalance. White has 2 rooks to 1 for black, but black has extra minor piece, including the bishop pair. So black has 2 bishops, white only has 1. Still, Stockfish eval 1.3. Now we see h5 going for the attack. And at this point, after a4, king to g7 is played. I'm not sure exactly why king g7 was played. He's probably thinking, I don't want to face h6, creating some problems here. But now king to f1, and Rapport has a 4-point advantage. Knight takes e2, queen takes e2. This was the critical mistake. So we're at move 22. You look at the clocks, 26 minutes for Rapport, 17 for Ding. Keep in mind, this tournament has no increment in the first 60 moves. So for the first 40 moves, they have to use all their time, and then they get a bonus between moves, or at move 40, and then another bonus at move 60. This 17 minutes for Ding has to be spent on 17 moves with no time delay and no bonus. So he's feeling the time pressure. If he calculates out the different captures, he would realize queen takes d8 is close to winning. This is not a very hard move to see. Knight takes c1, because these guys are super GMs. Queen to g5, and all of a sudden there's h6 check. The king goes back, and the rook is ready to come to the back rank. The queen is also ready to come to the back rank. Black is in huge trouble here. This is already a +6 Stockfish advantage. This would be winning. So missed attempt by Ding. He plays queen takes e2. This puts us down to the +1 territory. But keep in mind, those clocks are low still. So we see rook takes d1, rook takes d1. Now another mistake by Rapport. So Rapport is playing a little bit sloppy under time pressure. And Ding finds the best move. Bishop takes a6, scooping up that pawn. So now in terms of material, we have a rook for a bishop. This is +2. Rapport takes the bishop, queen takes back, tries to scoop up an extra pawn with queen takes e4. But again, another mistake. And I don't want to criticize these players because obviously the engine's much stronger, but I just want to point out the fact that Ding missed an opportunity to play for a win, but now he's presented with another one. So the move he needs to find, well, there's two moves actually, queen to e2 or h takes g6 followed by queen to e2. And the idea is after queen to e2, if the queens come off the board, this is a pretty straightforward win rook against bishop. And it's at least low risk, right? Black is not staying alive in that position or not playing for a win in that position. Um, Instead, he plays rook to e1, does not offer the queen trade. And I don't know if he felt that maybe Rapport could hold that position, but this gave away quite a bit of the advantage. We just went from +7 to +1.6, and it's marked a blunder. Queen to d4, strongest move. And now h takes g6, another mistake. This actually gives up pretty much the remainder of white's advantage. The best moves in the position are queen f3 and queen to e4. So the computer really likes going for this queen trade and trying to grind it out rook against bishop. I think the reason for that is because the rook is so agile. It can move up and down the files and the ranks, and the bishop can only stay on one color complex. That tends to create some problems for the side with the bishop. But Dingler-N's probably thinking Rapport has an extra pawn. That's maybe not enough to play for the win. But after h takes g6, h takes. At this point, the computer says even a queen trade offer is pretty close to a draw. Black can just avoid this trade. There's no extra pressure with that h pawn that white used to have. So the players played this out. This is move 30 currently. They played it out to move 40. Shook hands. You can check that game out on chess.com/events. All right, moving to game number 3, we have Fabiano Caruana against Jan-Krzysztof Duda. Now in this one, Fabiano has the white pieces against Duda, who's the second lowest rated player in the field. This feels like one that Fabiano would like to play for the win. And there's some really strong moves in this game coming up. We have a Sicilian defense, and this is called the Najdorf variation. Black plays a6 in combination with the earlier d6. And now we see e5 played by black, tucking the bishop behind. And oftentimes what white wants to do in these structures with the pawns on f3 and e4 is play for g4, g5, h4, h5, and tuck this king over on the queen side. So this is a very dynamic type of game in the Najdorf. Both sides are probably looking for sharp tactics and maybe playing for the win. h5 by black, that's a nice kind of modern prophylactic move, trying to prevent g4. And now we see Fabiano again playing aggressive. This tournament, he's not holding back. He's not just agreeing to quick draws. This, to me, shows that he wants to play for the win. Queenside castle. And it's not even the engine's favorite move. But Fabiano mentioned in one of the interviews that he's actually been looking for moves that the engine doesn't like quite as much as some of the other moves, but the opponents have more difficult to play positions. And that's really instructive. Like, that's something that we can use in our own games even. Don't just blindly trust the engine. Look for lines that are harder to play for the opponent than for yourself. That's something that I try to do building the chess goals courses. And honestly, I think that's like kind of the next level in terms of chess engines. There should be engines that are coming out eventually that say, this is the most practical move at your rating. This is the move that allows your opponent to make the most mistakes. They're most likely to mess up. I think that's kind of that's the future of chess computers, telling us what will work in human versus human play. We see bishop e7, king b1, b5. So black is trying to get these pawns rolling on the queen side. White wants the pawns going on the king side. And now we see a great move by Jan-Krzysztof. Bishop takes d5. This gives up the bishop pair, but what it does is it locks that pawn on d6. So even though d6 is a backward pawn, potential weakness, it's really hard to get at this pawn. So I think the strategic nature of this decision, taking on d5, was very good by Duda. It's a move that shows a lot of maturity, even though he's a young player. And he goes knight b6, and all of a sudden, the weakest pawn on the board is white's pawn on d5, and that bishop on f1 is having a lot of trouble getting into the game. So Fabiano cannot utilize his bishop pair yet. So Fabi trades off the bishop, plays knight a5. This is a good idea. He might be looking to play c4. He might just tuck the knight into c6 and try to be a pest. There's still ideas of g4 if the black king ends up over here. So there we go, knight into c6. And now we see this trade happen. And all of a sudden, Both players, I think, realize with the queens off the board, just bishop and knight, it's going to be very difficult for either side to play for the win. And we're 19 moves in. I'll show you what happened. They go 51 moves, but really neither side creates any sort of big advantage. Both players are playing solid. The pawns are pretty close to symmetric. We do have one extra e-pawn for one c-pawn, but as these pieces start trading off, it's very difficult for either side to play for the win. The players are too strong. They don't make big mistakes. We see there a sacrificed pawn by Fabiano, knowing that he could win back the b-pawn. And this bishop just has so much long-range power. He knows that these light pawns are weaknesses long-term, and the king's going to win this. So that exchange looked a little bit strange. Why is Fabi just sacking this pawn? He's okay with the draw. Both players know this is heading towards a draw, and this is kind of the simplest way to get there, I think. Because there's nothing Jan Christoph can do. Everything's trading off. The bishop sacks for the last pawn. And you can't win with just a knight. Knight sacks for that pawn. Draw agreed. So Fabiano still +1. Looking good. He did lose the game with the white pieces, though, meaning he lost one white opportunity. So the players perform a little bit better with the white pieces, and we will see that coming up in the odds, how that affects things. But first, we have the last game, and probably the most exciting game of the day. Alireza Firouzja with the white pieces against Hikaru Nakamura with the black pieces. I don't think they've ever played in classical chess prior to this game. We see the Nimzo Indian with queen to c2. Very solid by Alireza. And now we get this kind of classic bishop pair imbalance. We've seen this all tournament. There's a lot of games focusing on the bishop pair. That's how strong players like to play for the win, either having the bishop pair or having some sort of compensation for it, where they can kind of fight against the bishop pair and see what they can do against it. So at this point, we see d5, bishop g5, trade happens. And both sides are playing strong book moves. The computer's saying close to even. This is all pretty natural. c5, so what black is doing here, Hikaru wants to trade off the d pawn for the c pawn, trading wing pawn for a center pawn. That's a good way to neutralize your opponent's advantage in the center. So kind of neutralizing this d4 pawn. e4, strong move by Hikaru, takes on f1. So here, Alireza loses castling. He does have the big center, though, and he does have a strong bishop, hitting the knight through all the way through to d8. Hikaru plays g5. We've seen this a couple times this tournament. We saw Hikaru play g5 against Fabiano in the first round, I believe it was. He's playing aggressive here. And if this bishop has to retreat, black has a better position. The computer loves black here. That leaves only one option for Alireza. He had an hour 55 on the clock to Hikaru's hour and 28. I think he might have still been in book, and he snaps this pawn off. Chess.com gives it the brilliant symbol. You can see it right here below my face. This is a cool move. It's a straight piece sack. It's a long-term sacrifice, and he's looking to play e5, hitting the pinned piece. Knight to c6, and he's not playing e5 straight away. It could go e5, knight takes pawn. Instead, Alireza plays aggressive. Queen to c1. This queen is looking to infiltrate on the king side. Alireza looks like he's playing for a win, and he's blitzing these moves out. Hikaru is feeling the pressure. And look at the clock here. 1 hour and 27 minutes. Rook takes d4. He's down to 45 minutes. That's an insanely long think. 27 minutes plus 15 minutes. What is that? 42 minutes? A 42-minute think on one move. And now Hikaru is in some big time pressure. Only half his time remaining, but they're on move 18. Typically, you play a lot faster in the opening. Save that time to get to move 40. So the rook's trade off. Queen to f4. Here comes the queen from Alireza. But this king is still in a little bit of danger. So what Hikaru did here, and I like this decision, he played knight to c2 check, and then queen check, freeing himself from this pin, giving up the c2 knight, knowing though that he was going to trade back here and get the queen trade. So that was kind of his way to get to safety. He found a cool way to get the queen trade. And with the clock situation, Hikaru wants to try to defend this endgame for a draw. I don't think Hikaru is really playing for the win at this point. Alireza out-prepared him in the opening. Hikaru handled it well, got to this position. I think Hikaru would be completely satisfied with a draw here. Alireza is the one that can play for the win still. So what Alireza is doing here is he has this passed H pawn. He can try to push that pawn up the board. It increases his advantage that way. Alireza is looking to play probably G4 at some point, take back with F, and maybe have connected pass pawns. There it is, G4. Takes. I do like white here. I like the look of these connected passers. Rook to F1 check. Good move. And these pawns are getting scary. That king just stepped away from the pawns. This rook cuts off the F file. And this lone rook on G8 is left trying to defend connected passers with the bishop nearby. Now we see pawn to H6. Brilliant move by Firouzja. This allows Hikaru to take the bishop, but H7 is played and the queen promotion cannot be stopped. What a move. After H6, Hikaru finds the strongest reply, rook to F8. And at this point, Alireza has his largest lead in the game, +1. He lets things slip a little bit here. Unfortunately, he traded rooks. He just went rook takes F8. And Hikaru had a super impressive defense. He really knew what to do in the position and played very quickly. He only had 12 minutes on the clock. What Firouzja needs to do here is play rook to G1, avoid this trade, and try to keep the rooks on the board in combination with the pressure of these pawns. Like this bishop could drop back and this G pawn can start pushing. That's Firouzja's best chance to play for a win. I still think at this point, if I were to put odds on it, it's maybe like 70% draw, 30% win for Firouzja, maybe 80-20, but definitely there is some chances here for white to play for the win. But after the rook trade, Hikaru really showed his endgame prowess. He had this endgame figured out. He knew this position would be impossible for Firouzja to win as long as Nakamura did not make a mistake. He trades off these pawns, recognizing that if this king starts running up to help these pawns, simply b4 can be played, and if capture, this pawn runs down the a file. So there's no way that Firouzja's king can leave the defense of the a pawn. And this bishop on d8 is kind of a clumsy piece because it can't easily check the black king. If that bishop could get on this diagonal, for example, and check the king, then he could promote. There's no way to check the king because look at this knight. The knight's controlling all of these dark squares. How does that bishop rearrange to a position that it can check on the long diagonal? You would have to try to get to b2. So let's see if he can do that. Bishop to g5, pawn to e5. So what happens here if this bishop tries to sneak onto the diagonal? It looks like there's a bunch of moves for black that all hold the draw. But the simplest way to do it is probably knight to e7, because the knight can actually capture this pawn. Bishop to b2. Knight takes g6, defending this pawn, and it's still going to be a draw. But it's actually kind of a tougher draw for Firouzja to hold now, because this pawn's also dropping. So we see that this bishop is actually trying to defend the knight from going to one of these two squares and grabbing this pawn on g6. So they're kind of in this mutual zugzwang. The knight doesn't want to move. The bishop doesn't want to move. And Hikaru had this completely calculated out. He was blitzing out his moves. Even after move 40, he was moving very quickly. So Firouzja spent a lot of time. We're at move 46. He's down to 16 minutes. He was really trying to figure out, how do I win this position? Can I march this king over any closer? But he can't really leave the defense of the a pawn. So now we see queenside push by Nakamura. This bishop has to come back to defend. And at this point, the players know it's going to be a draw. They had this all calculated out. Takes. King against knight. Dead draw. So we see 4 draws. And let's see how that affects the odds. Caruana lost one game with the white pieces there. You see him slip below the 40% mark. He has 2 points out of 3, right around 39%. Nepomniachtchi had a draw with the black pieces, so he's got an extra white going forward. He goes up a little bit. We see Nakamura and Firouzja flip spots. That's because of the colors as well. So in their remaining game, Nakamura will be white when he plays Firouzja. That's an advantage. And that's kind of the only effects that we see in the odds here. It's based on which colors the players had. So the players who drew with white dropped a little bit. Players who drew with black gained a little bit in the odds. So that's the round 3 recap. Right now we have Chess Goals opening courses on sale, 25% off. Check those out in the description. You have a money back guarantee. I hope you guys enjoyed this recap, and we'll see you in tomorrow's video.